Welcome to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Coming up, we'll review the week's top stories about continued reaction to the election of Donald Trump to be the next president, a proposed tax increase on millionaires and small businesses, and the latest in the corruption trial of former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan. I'll then join the Center Square's Dan McCaleb to further discuss those stories and more. That's ahead with Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop.
Do you know what elected officials in Illinois are doing with your tax dollars? Do you want to make sure that your voice is heard? If so, then you need Blue Room Stream, a live and archived video streaming service that provides access to government meetings and events. With Blue Room Stream, you can watch how your elected officials make decisions, hold them accountable for their actions, and be a more informed citizen. Blue Room Stream is the perfect way to get involved in the democratic process and to make a difference in your community. Subscribe today at blueroomstream.com.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. A leading Illinois House Republican says Governor J.B. Pritzker needs to stop his, quote, macho man routine and work with the incoming Trump administration to grow the state's economy. Donald Trump didn't just win the Electoral College last week, he also won the popular vote, and Republicans have control of both chambers of Congress. Last week, Governor J.B. Pritzker said he'll stand up to Trump.
To anyone who intends to come take away the freedom and opportunity and dignity of Illinoisans, I would remind you that a happy warrior is still a warrior. You come for my people, you come through me.
Wednesday, Republican State Representative Ryan Spain said Pritzker needs to drop the act.
Offering some sort of gubernatorial macho man moment, saying that Donald Trump needs to come through him in order to deliver help to the people of the state of Illinois. Governor, let me be clear, that's the wrong message.
After canceling Thursday's session, legislators return Tuesday for the final 3 days of fall veto session. Now that voters have shown support for the non-binding question to tax millionaires an additional 3% to fund property tax relief rebates, some are pushing to amend the Illinois Constitution. Former Illinois Governor Pat Quinn said the 60% approval of the non-binding referendum is a sign that legislators need to approve a constitutional amendment for voters to vote on in 2026. Chicagoland Black Chamber of Commerce Chairman Cornell Darden Jr. said such an idea is harmful, anti-capitalist, and would hurt those who are successful. He said there needs to be real reform to the state's property tax system. He even suggested people stop paying property taxes.
We need to send a shockwave and make sure there lights a fire under the General Assembly to actually come up with a common sense solution. And if you can't come up with one, then just shut it down.
To the idea the millionaire surcharge wouldn't do anything to reform the state's property tax system, which is among the most expensive in the country, Quinn said that can come later.
Other reforms, I think, are very important, but we're not going to wait on them.
Any such question on the ballot must be approved by a supermajority of the Illinois legislature. And government attorneys have introduced new witnesses, emails, and a barrage of recordings at the corruption trial of former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan. Jim Talamonte reports.
Government attorneys displayed documents related to Michael Madigan and co-defendant Michael McLean's dealings with ComEd and payments to Madigan's allies for jobs which prosecutors said required little or no work. Former Assistant U.S. Attorney Patrick Caulkins said the government still faces the burden of proof.
You're going to have this tension between this mountain of circumstantial evidence and the lack of direct evidence, and I think that, as I see it from 50,000 feet, that's the particular challenge for the prosecutors in this case.
Prosecutors called 8 new witnesses and introduced about 20 new recordings on Thursday. Government attorneys indicated that former Chicago Alderman Danny Solis is expected to testify next week. In Chicago, I'm Jim Talamonte.
Those are the top stories of the week from Illinois. Find more online at thecentersquare.com. Coming up for Illinois in Focus, I'll join the Center Square's Dan McCaleb to further discuss the news. This is Illinois in Focus, a production of America's Talking Network. I'm Greg Bishop.
Tired of being in the dark about what happens day to day under the dome in Springfield? Do you want to be more informed in the decision-making process? If so, you need Blue Room Stream, a live and archived video streaming service that provides access to government meetings and events. With Blue Room Stream, you can watch elected officials in action, holding them accountable, and having your say on issues that matter most to you. Blue Room Stream is the perfect way to stay informed about Illinois state government and to be a more engaged citizen. Become a subscriber today at blueroomstream.com.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Dan McCaleb, Chief Content Officer at Franklin News Foundation, publisher of the Center Square Newswire service. Illinois state legislatures returned to Springfield for the first week of veto session this week, but with no vetoes to override, not a lot has happened legislatively. One measure being considered, bringing Tier 2 public employee pensions in line with Social Security requirements, would cost taxpayers an additional $5 billion over several years, according to estimates. Joining me to discuss this is Greg Bishop, Illinois Associate Editor at the Center Square. Greg, this is a bit complicated, so let's start with an explanation of what Tier 2 pensions are.
Sure. So Illinois has a $140 billion unfunded pension liability for those who are promised certain benefits after they work for the state of Illinois or for even some local governments like firefighters, police, teachers, public sector employees. So the overall state unfunded liability is $140 billion. If you work in the local taxing bodies, unfunded liability, it grows substantially. But what Tier 1 is, it's the original kind of, group of employees that were hired before 2011. Now, back in 2010, there was a lot of conversation about the state's unfunded pension liability. So legislators got together and they approved what's now considered Tier 2 benefits. So it's a new cohort of those who are expecting public sector retiree benefits. So Tier 2 was passed in 2010, enacted in 2011, and it was meant to lower the taxpayer obligation for new employees hired into the system. And it saves some taxpayers dollars, but still we're looking at, as of today, last numbers I've seen, $140 billion unfunded liability. For the past year and a half or so, there's been a conversation about those Tier 2 benefits and how they may not meet certain standards through Social Security. They may not be getting enough benefits to be the equivalent of meeting what Social Security requirements are. So there's been a push to change Tier 2 benefits, either enhance them or somehow try to bring them in line with Social Security safe harbor provisions. But clearly, this is a conversation that's been growing, and it's going to come to a head at some point because there were hundreds of public sector employees rallying at the State House this week during fall veto session, holding up signs saying fix Tier 2. There's been concerns raised by legislators saying that the Tier 2 pension benefits are not enough of a recruitment tool to bring in new teachers or to bring in new employees to work in the public sector. But obviously, with $140 billion of unfunded liability, with the concerns that there may be penalties paid for not allegedly being in line with Social Security equivalency, this is going to come to a head very soon, Dan.
Greg, it feels like we've been covering the pension issue, the pension liability issue for years and years and years. It seems like this $140 billion figure, what's underfunded right now for the obligations the state is taking on for its retirement benefits for retired workers. And we're only talking about pensions. We're not talking about medical liability, too. There's healthcare hundreds of billion or more than $100 billion in healthcare liabilities, too. But just on this, the pensions, we've been stuck at this $140 billion figure feels like anyway, for years. So while the Tier 2 beneficiaries are currently would receive less benefits than the Tier 1 beneficiaries, it's not reducing the unfunded pension liability. It's not gone up for a number of years, but it's not come down at all either. They quote unquote fix the issue with Social Security and bring Tier 2 pensions in line. It seems to me like that liability could be going back up.
The pension obligation did go down a few years ago, but only to like $138 billion, but then it went back up to $140 billion. Dan, just to put this in perspective, on an annual basis, Illinois spends $10 billion every year just to pay pension benefits. Some argue that's not enough in the annual budget. Some say that, there could be troubled waters down the way if interest rates go down and rates of return on investments go down. that means more tax dollars are going to have to be used to fund that obligation every year, let alone the $140 billion that's estimated to be the unfunded liability if everybody was to retire all of a sudden. Right now, we've got about a 42% funding ratio, which those who look at finances for retirees say you want that funding ratio to be 100%. So it's no question Illinois has poorly funded pensions. Everybody knows this. And the Tier 2 was meant to try to soften the blow a bit, especially with this Edgar ramp that we've got, named after former Governor Jim Edgar, who instituted a ramping of paying off pensions. So that $10 billion is expected to grow quite a bit over the next 10, 15 years before it does start to come down a bit. And then the funding ratio will grow. It's expected the amount of annual dollars to pensions may decrease, but that's not going to happen until 2040 or so. So clearly, again, this is an issue that's coming to a head. The big question is how do we get around this? Do we go with what labor unions want to increase Tier 2 pension benefits, or do we just want to increase it to go to the Social Security number that would make it the equivalent of the Social Security replacement plan for Tier 2? Governor Pritzker said that could cost $5 billion over several years, so that may add to the unfunded liability. But others I've heard, in one particular proposal, I don't know if it ever got into bill form, but it was brought up during discussion when they were talking about this during spring session. They had a committee hearing about this issue, heard about the problems of trying to recruit people, the need to meet with Social Security equivalency. But State Representative Blaine Wilhauer said an easy fix would be just to individually go through, and if somebody doesn't meet the safe harbor provision when the calculation's done, just give them X dollars plus one to meet that Social Security equivalency. But that did not seem to get any recognition. And a lot of this is convoluted in legalities and how they craft legislation. And when it's actually going to happen, it's very unclear. Nothing happened this week in veto session. Not sure much is going to happen next week in veto session. Governor J.B. Pritzker said, it could happen next year or not. But again, something that we're keeping a close eye on, as we have for the decade I've been on the ground here at the Capitol in Springfield.
Greg, I'm just a little bit older than you, and I've been covering Illinois government for 20 years now. It was a big deal, a big issue, a big concern when I first started covering Illinois state government. It just doesn't seem like there's any solution in sight.
There are solutions out there. It's, I guess, where the political will comes from, right? For instance, we had an election, and in that election, there were 3 non-binding questions on the ballot. One dealt with IVF treatment. Another one dealt with election worker security. The other one dealt with, hey, should we increase taxes on millionaires? These were non-binding, but, why not gauge public interest in other ideas? Like, for instance, changing the state's constitution pension protection clause. It could be a non-binding question, gauge what the public is interested in. Right. But I don't know if there's political will out there to ask those types of tough questions. Yeah. And Dan, this isn't just state government. This is local governments, too. For years, I covered the Springfield City Council, and they regularly complained about how their entire share of real estate taxes that the city of Springfield collects is going to pay for pension benefits. So clearly, this is an issue not just for state taxpayers, but right there, look at your taxing bodies locally. And, depending on where they're at in the states, they could be having similar types of pension issues.
As we discussed last week, Greg, new budget projections from Governor J.B. Pritzker's Office of Management and Budget show an annual $5 billion deficit over the next few years. Adding additional pension costs to the budget might even, exacerbate that unless they decide not to add dollars to the pensions and the liability grows. Republicans responded to that deficit projection during a veto session news conference. What did they have to say?
Well, they said that clearly COVID relief tax dollars from the federal government did play a role in the state being able to balance some annual budgets the past 4 years. But with those dollars dried up, there's that hole in the budget that's being projected, $3 billion for next year. Dan, the 5-year projections have a total of $22.2 billion in projected deficits with $5 billion in deficits by 2030. All of that while the state continues to spend an expectation of $10 billion more in spending by 2030, up to $63 billion. Republicans said enough's enough. There needs to be some efficiencies. State Senator Sally Turner, she said that we're focusing too much on non-citizens and giving them health care and giving them $1 billion+ dollars. And she said it's interesting that we've been spending that much on health care subsidies for non-citizens and housing and legal assistance and education and food. But this budget was enacted this summer included nearly $1 billion tax increase. State Senator Chapin Rose said enough's enough. People are tapped out. He said that he can't expect taxpayers to continue taking tax increases to make up for increased spending. The governor, on the other hand, says that he plans to file a balanced budget in February when he proposes that budget in front of the General Assembly. Now, he also says that these projections are done every year, and he also says they prove them wrong every year. So I guess we'll see what comes out in the wash for the proposed budget coming up in February. But clearly there's a big concern about the call for more tax increases to make up for this deficit that's expected in the budget.
And of course, Governor Pritzker also continues to deny that the state's population is shrinking besides massive amounts of evidence to the contrary from the U.S. Census Bureau, from the IRS, things like that. So he says these budget projections have been proven wrong in the past. I guess we'll see.
I'll be watching and taking plenty of notes, Dan, to see how the governor expects to spend our tax dollars.
I know you will. Greg, a federal judge finally ruled that Illinois' gun ban, a ban on more than 170 semi-automatic guns and rifles, as well as magazines over a certain capacity, is in fact unconstitutional. But he stayed his ruling for 30 days to allow the state to appeal. Tell us more.
Yeah, this was a 168-page ruling that Southern District of Illinois federal judge Stephen McGlynn issued Friday afternoon. And essentially, he spelled out why he believes the state's law banning 170 semi-automatic firearms is unconstitutional. He says that they are commonly owned firearms. The firearms that are banned are not military-grade firearms. They're not fully auto. And he also highlights some of the things that were talked about during the 4-day bench trial he held in the East St. Louis court, where there were experts saying that military-grade firearms are built differently. They're made with different composites of metal. You can't take a consumer-grade AR-15 and put it through the same type of stress test that you can with a military-grade rifle that goes full auto or burst. He also said that the attachments, the magazine ban that's part of this Illinois law that was challenged. He said that the magazines are important for those defending themselves from aggressors to be able to have enough ammunition to defend themselves. So he really, in the 168-page ruling, pushed back on the state, saying that the gun ban is unconstitutional, violating the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms and the 14th Amendment. So this is an expected ruling, given how McGlynn had ruled previously last year on preliminary grounds. If you remember, in April 2023, just 3.5 months or so after Governor J.B. Pritzker signed the law into effect, McGlynn issued a preliminary injunction that lasted 6 days. It was an immediate injunction, but only 6 days went by where the state was prohibited from enforcing the law. The state got a stay on that ruling from the appeals court. All that preliminary stuff's done. Friday, McGlynn issued final judgment. This was final action in the district court. So now it's going to go to the appeals court. But again, McGlynn saying there's a permanent injunction on this, but he held that for 30 days to allow the state to appeal. The state filed an intent to appeal in the district courts. I did check earlier today on the appeals court page, and it has not been officially filed to the appeals court. So I anticipate that we may see that filing to the appeals courts on day 29 of the 30-day stay that McGlynn put into effect, probably the last hour of that 29th or maybe even 30th day. These things always tend to go that way. The attorneys take all the way up to the deadline to file their things. So we'll see that appeal filed. Attorney General Kwame Raoul said he is unapologetic about the appeal. Governor J.B. Pritzker said the law needs to be upheld because it's keeping people safe. But plaintiffs say it's a clear violation of their constitutional rights to be able to have access to commonly owned firearms. And those commonly owned firearms being AR-15s, certain types of other semi-automatic shotguns, even some handguns that may have a magazine of over 15 rounds. Different types of attachments are banned. But if the state does not get a stay of the permanent injunction by December 8th,
Moving on, though, Greg, former ComEd executive Fidel Marquez, a cooperating witness in the federal government's prosecution of former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan, has been a witness on the witness stand at Madigan's trial for more than a week now. What's he telling jurors?
He's telling jurors quite a bit, and especially when it's matched up to undercover audio and video recordings that prosecutors are releasing en masse. There are hundreds of transcripts and recordings and video and phone calls and emails that have been presented to jurors. And a lot of it in the past week, Fidel Marquez really, as a prosecution witness in this, revealing the inner workings of what federal prosecutors allege is Madigan Enterprise, nearly decade-long scheme to get little to do nothing jobs for their allies in exchange for getting legislation passed that was favorable to ComEd. So Marquez, some of the things he's showing are, for instance, conversations he's had with McGlynn about doing things for, quote, our friend, which he says is Madigan. And those favors include getting jobs for Madigan allies within the 13th Ward, where Madigan was a leader. These allies might have been let go from other jobs. One in particular, somebody who's a brother of a congressman at the time, was fired from the Department of Corrections, and there was talk about trying to line up a job for this individual as a favor to, quote, our friend. So a lot of revelations. But what's interesting, Dan, is the evidence that prosecutors have released so far. A lot of it's similar. Most of it, I would say all of it, is similar to what they revealed in the ComEd 4 trial. But what I've seen is, for instance, one video they released of Marquez having dinner with McGlynn. They're eating pizza, talking about getting jobs lined up for Madigan Associates and how to approach different employers with this scheme. You've got, during the ComEd 4 trial, a clip released, but then for this one, for the Madigan trial, prosecutors released kind of, extra footage of the same incident. And in particular, this dinner, what was not included in the ComEd footage was just a brief quip of McGlynn telling Marquez about him giving a retirement letter to Madigan, and Madigan essentially saying, no, you're not retiring. And they chuckled about it. Then they went on to talk about the jobs, which, again, was released in the ComEd 4 trial.
And, of course, the ComEd 4 executives and or lobbyists tied to ComEd were found guilty by a jury during their trial last year, and ComEd itself, in a deferred prosecution agreement, agreed to pay $200 million in fines to avoid criminal charges against that company. Greg, we still expecting this trial to last well into December, maybe even into January?
Not sure how many more witnesses prosecutors are going to bring up onto the stand, but then you got to think, Dan, we've also got, defense witnesses. What kind of witnesses are going to be brought up to share their thoughts? So we still have weeks to go. Some are anticipating it could go into early next year.
Greg, thank you for joining us today. Listeners can keep up with all of these stories and more at thecentersquare.com.